Ways to End a Life. Best Ways to Suffocate. 16 Steps to Get Away with It. 2017. Fairbanks, Alaska. A young mother sits in the low light of her living room. Her face is illuminated by the cold blue glow of a laptop screen. She isn't looking for parenting advice. She is researching a manual for the unthinkable. Less than 60 minutes after those words were typed into a search engine, she is on the phone with 911. Her voice is a mask of panic. She claims her 13-month-old daughter has stopped breathing, but this wasn't a tragic accident. 2 years earlier, her 4-month-old daughter had passed away under identical circumstances. For years, she lived as a grieving parent, hiding a secret as dark as the Alaskan winter. Welcome to Cold Read Crimes. Today, we are heading into the heart of the last frontier to uncover 10 cases of mothers in Alaska whose actions shocked the nation. These are the stories that forced investigators to look past the grieving mother persona to find the truth hidden in the digital footprints and the forensic files. Before we move into our first case, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? And what's the weather like today? Drop a comment below. It helps the channel more than you know. If you value deep dive research into true legal cases, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon. We are building a community of armchair detectives, and we'd love for you to join us. The accounts we are discussing today challenge everything we think we know about maternal instinct. We are looking at the calculated strategist in Fairbanks, the reality of bush culture in Bethel, and the PTA mom mask used to hide a dark past in the 90s. These are not just stories of loss. They are forensic puzzles that took years to solve. Let's begin our investigation into the 10 most notorious cases of maternal malice in the history of Alaska. This is the first case in our investigation into the 10 most notorious legal accounts in Alaska. In this segment, we examine the details of the Fairbanks cases involving Stefan. Case 1. Stephanie Bielecki. The case of Stephanie Elizabeth Bielecki, formerly known as Stephanie LaFountain, stands as a landmark in the use of digital forensics within the Alaskan justice system. In December 2024, at the age of 29, Bielecki was sentenced to a total of 130 years in prison for the deaths of her 2 infant daughters, Chiani and Jasmine. This story began years earlier, hidden under the mask of a grieving parent and the biological complexities of infant mortality. In September 2015, Bielecki lived in an apartment in Fairbanks. She called emergency dispatchers just after 5 in the afternoon to report that her 4-month-old daughter, Chian, had stopped breathing. At that time, the infant was otherwise healthy, and with no visible signs of trauma, the death was initially categorized as sudden infant death syndrome. But the behavior of the mother during those critical minutes was a red flag that would only be fully understood years later. Data from that afternoon revealed that Bielecki waited 10 minutes after finding her daughter unresponsive to call 911. During that 10-minute gap, she made calls to her boyfriend and her mother, only dialing emergency services. Just as her mother was arriving at the residence, the mask remained in place for 2 years. Bielecki eventually married a soldier and moved to the Fort Wainwright Army Post. In November 2017, history repeated itself. Bielecki reported that her second daughter, 13-month-old Jasmine, was not breathing. Again, the pattern of delayed reporting emerged. Before calling 911, she attempted to contact her deployed husband and her in-laws. Jasmine was transported to Fairbanks Memorial Hospital and later transferred to a SAN medical facility in Anchorage, where she passed away 4 days later. The second infant death in the same household triggered a much deeper inquiry by the Fairbanks Police Department. The shift from a tragic coincidence to a criminal prosecution was driven by what investigators found inside Bielecki's smartphone. Digital records showed that in the hour leading up to her emergency call for Jasmine, she had conducted a series of highly specific and targeted internet searches. These queries included ways to suffocate, best ways to suffocate, ways to kill a human with no proof, and drugs that can kill people with no trace. She even researched whether drowning would be visible in an autopsy report and looked for a 16-step guide to commit a crime without being caught. These discoveries stripped away the defense of a natural tragedy. The authorities concluded that both infants had been suffocated. During the legal proceedings, prosecutors described the actions as shocking to the conscience. The court found that Bielecki had a very low potential for rehabilitation, noting what they described as sociopathic tendencies and a profound lack of empathy for her own children. Alexi eventually pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder in the second degree in August 2024. At her sentencing, a composite term of 130 years was handed down, with 85 years of that sentence suspended. As a permanent condition of her sentence, she is prohibited from having any unsupervised contact with minors under the age of 16 in non-public settings. This Fairbanks case serves as a disturbing example of how a perpetrator can use the isolation of the domestic sphere to hide their actions. It was only the integration of modern digital evidence that allowed investigators to see past the grieving mother persona and secure justice for Diane and Jasmine. 2 fathers were deprived of seeing their daughters grow up, a loss that the Fairbanks district attorney described as incalculable to the community. We now move from the digital world of Fairbanks to the isolated hub of Bethel. Case 2, Stephanie Olrun, Bethel, Alaska, is a community that serves as the regional hub for 56 villages across the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. It is a place only accessible by air or water, where the vastness of the tundra defines the pace of life. On March 2021, the silence of this remote setting was broken by a phone call that would eventually lead to a high-profile murder conviction. Stephanie Olrun, a 36-year-old mother, contacted her sister with a statement that was as flat as it was devastating. She stated that she had lost control and that her 2-year-old adopted daughter, Jane, was no longer alive. When the Bethel Police Department arrived at the residence at 4:30 in the morning, they found a scene that contradicted the typical image of a sudden medical emergency. 2-year-old Jane was lying on a towel, unresponsive but still warm to the touch. Despite immediate efforts to perform chest compressions and the rapid arrival of paramedics, the toddler was declared dead just 10 minutes after reaching the hospital. In her initial statements to the authorities, Olrun admitted to the physical acts that led to the child's death, telling officers that she had kicked and thrown the little girl. The subsequent forensic investigation revealed that this was not a single isolated moment of impulsivity. Instead, the autopsy provided a map of systemic long-term failure and trauma. Medical personnel documented 40 fresh and healing injuries across the child's body. These were not just surface-level marks, they included healing fractures on Jane's left upper jawbone, her shoulder, her right arm, and the back portion of her skull. Furthermore, the toddler was found to be severely malnourished, a condition that suggests a persistent lack of basic care over a significant period. The legal proceedings in Bethel highlighted the complexities of domestic violence in rural settings. For 3 years, Olrun maintained a plea of not guilty to a charge of murder in the first degree. On January 16, 2024, she changed her plea as part of a negotiated agreement with the state. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of murder in the second degree, while additional charges, including assault in the first degree and tampering with physical evidence. During the hearing, prosecutors noted the emotional weight of the evidence, observing that Olrun was clearly upset throughout the process. The court was tasked with balancing the defendant's expression of remorse against the extreme nature of the physical trauma Jane had endured. The plea agreement established a sentencing range between 20 and 99 years, with a specific cap of 60 years of active jail time to serve. The case of Stephanie Olrun is a stark reminder of the apathy-neglect continuum often seen in isolated domestic environments. In rural hubs like Bethel, the lack of immediate social service intervention can allow a history of abuse to remain hidden until it reaches a point of extremist violence. The court's focus on community condemnation and the reaffirmation of societal norms reflects the profound impact such a betrayal of the maternal bond has on the tight-knit communities of Western Alaska. Jane was a child who had been adopted into a home that was meant to be her safety net, yet the medical records proved that the environment had been one of prolonged peril. Case 3, Marley, Anchorage, Alaska, is a city where the modern world meets the edge of the wilderness. It is a place of neighborhoods and schools, yet the shadow of the frontier is never far away. In November 2020, the residents of a home on Record Drive became the focus of a welfare check that would expose a profound detachment from reality. Marley Jolie Mark, a 32-year-old mother, was at the center of an event that local authorities described as a domestic violence offense against an exceptionally vulnerable victim, her 5-year-old son, Job Christensen. The timeline of this case is marked by a period of silence that lasted 5 days. Family members grew increasingly worried after they were unable to contact Mark or her young son. At 4 in the morning on November 25, 2020, the Anchorage Police Department took the step of forcing entry into the residence. Inside, they found the body of 5-year-old Job. The forensic evidence was unambiguous. The autopsy revealed that the child had passed away due to fatal sharp force wounds to his neck and throat. This method of violence suggests an intense level of aggression and a total breakdown of the protective mechanisms that define the relationship between a parent and a child. While the discovery of Job was the focus of the homicide unit, the behavior of the mother in the hours immediately following the incident provided further insight into her mental state. On the morning of November 20, at around 6 o'clock, at a local gas station, she was found asleep in the vehicle, alone. When the officers attempted to speak with her, the interaction did not go as expected. Mechele did not seek help or explain what had happened at her home. Instead, she produced a large knife and assaulted the 2 officers, placing them in fear of serious physical injury. Mechele was arrested at the gas station for the assaults and was remanded to the Hillyer Mountain Correctional Center. It was only after her arrest that the investigation into the welfare of her son led police back to the apartment on Wrecker Drive. This sequence of events meant that Mechele was already in custody when the homicide charges were eventually filed. A grand jury later indicted her on 1 count of murder in the first degree, 2 counts of murder in the second degree, and manslaughter, as well as multiple counts of assault related to the knife attack on the officers and a separate incident involving her brother. The legal proceedings spanned nearly 3 years. In October 2023, following a 5-week jury trial, Mechele was found guilty of the murder of her son. During the sentencing hearing on February 2020, the emotional weight of the case was felt through the victim impact statements provided by Job's grandparents. They spoke of a sweet, kind-hearted boy who loved to play and just be a kid. Judge Peter Ramgren, in handing down the sentence, emphasized that the court's focus must be on community condemnation and the deterrence of such actions in the future. The judge sentenced Mark to 80 years in prison, with 30 years of that time suspended. Consequently, she was ordered to serve 50 active years for the murder of Job Christensen. He noted that the sentence served as a reformation of societal norms, a necessary legal statement when the maternal archetype is so violently shattered. The case of Marley Mechele highlights a terrifyingly cold pragmatism, where the perpetrator's immediate reactions, falling asleep in a truck and attacking police, showed no evidence of the expected grief or remorse associated with the loss of a child. Before we transition to our next investigation, I want to take a moment to engage with our community. Where are you watching from today? It is always a reminder of the importance of these stories when we see our viewers tuning in from all 50 states and beyond. Moving from the sudden force of a single act, we now turn to a tragedy that unfolded in slow motion within an urban trailer park. This explores the lethal nature of apathy and a defense that the legal system eventually rejected as a mask for willful neglect. Case for Stephanie Hamburg. On May 2017, the Anchorage Police Department responded to a distress call from the 9500 block of Brayton Drive. The report was one that every first responder dreads. A young child was unconscious and had stopped breathing. When officers arrived at the trailer, they found 2-year-old Gabriella Marlowe. Despite the immediate efforts of the Anchorage Fire Department and medical teams at a local hospital, the toddler was pronounced dead. At first glance, the case appeared to be a medical emergency of unknown origin, but as detectives examined the environment and the medical history of the child, a landscape of profound neglect began to emerge. The subsequent autopsy provided a definitive and devastating cause of death. 2-year-old Gabriella had died of congestive heart failure. The primary catalyst for this condition was extreme malnutrition. The legal inquiry revealed that the child's diet had been severely restricted for a long period. Her main source of nutrition consisted almost entirely of whole milk, supplemented occasionally by soda pop, specifically Dr. Pepper. Records showed that Gabriella had not been examined by a medical professional since she was only 9 months old, meaning she had missed over a year of critical developmental checkups and nutritional monitoring during a peak growth period. The suspects in the case, 45-year-old Stephanie Hamburg and her 50-year-old boyfriend, Timothy Halsey, offered a defense that they believed would explain the child's condition. They told detectives that they thought the little girl would simply outgrow her lack of interest in food and that her refusal to eat was just a stage. They claimed to believe that fluids were sufficient for a child of her age. However, the state took a different view. Prosecutors argued that failing to provide basic nutrition and medical care for a toddler over the course of an entire year constituted a willful failure of the most basic parental duty. The path to a conviction was long, marked by a multi-year legal process. On December 2025, a jury in Anchorage reached a verdict. Both Stephanie Hamburg and Timothy Halsey were convicted on 1 count each of criminally negligent homicide. While the state had originally looked at more severe charges, the jury determined that the evidence supported the finding of criminal negligence, a legal standard where a person fails to perceive a substantial and unjustifiable risk that an act or omission will cause a death. At the time of the conviction, it was noted that Hamburg had previously evaded capture. In November 2017, a felony warrant had been issued for her arrest, and she was eventually located by the Anchorage Investigative Support Unit, hiding inside a residence on Brayton Drive. Her arrest brought a temporary end to a case that the community found deeply distressing. The sentencing for Hamburg and Halsey is scheduled for April 17, 2026. They face a prison term ranging from 2 to 4 years. For many in the community, the sentence felt small compared to the prolonged suffering of a 2-year-old child who was essentially starved in an urban neighborhood where help was only a few blocks away. The case of Stephanie Hamburg serves as a reminder that the most dangerous environments for children are not always marked by active violence, but by a slow, silent detachment from the responsibility of care. If you find these deep dive investigations into the justice system and the importance of child welfare reform important, please hit the like button. Every interaction helps ensure these stories reach others who value true crime education and the preservation of legal transparency. Case 5, Heather Alexi. Fairbanks is a city defined by its grit and its ability to withstand some of the harshest winters in the United States. On February 2025, the silence of a residence on University Avenue was broken by a welfare check that would expose a profound tragedy. The incident began when a concerned individual, who was a client of 36-year-old Heather Alexi, reported that they had not heard from her for quite some time. This person eventually went to the apartment on the 1700 block of University Avenue to check on the well-being of the mother and her 2 young children. Upon entering the residence on Friday, February 7, the visitor made a discovery that led to an immediate response from the Fairbanks Police Department. Inside the home, they found the body of a young boy. Investigators arrived on the scene and confirmed the victim was Peter Alexi, Heather's 6-year-old son. The evidence at the scene indicated that the child had been the victim of a homicide. As detectives processed the area, a second priority emerged. Both the mother and her 5-year-old daughter, Renee, were missing from the scene. The Fairbanks Police Department immediately issued a missing persons and suspicious circumstances alert, seeking the public's assistance in locating the mother and the surviving child. The search for Heather Alexi provides a clear example of how modern digital forensics has transformed investigations in the last frontier. By tracking cell phone data, authorities were able to follow Heather's movement as she traveled hundreds of miles south along the Alaskan highway system. By Saturday evening, less than 24 hours after the discovery of Peter's body, the Anchorage Police Department located Heather and Renee in the state's largest city. While the 5-year-old girl was found to be physically safe and was immediately taken into state custody, the mother was detained for questioning. During her interview with homicide detectives, Heather admitted to inflicting the injuries that led to the death of her son days before she left Fairbanks. Based on this admission and the forensic findings from the Fairbanks apartment, Heather Alexi was arrested and charged with murder in the 2nd degree. This case illustrates a disturbing concept known as the fragmentation of the maternal self. Heather was able to reconcile the act of causing the death of one child with the continued care and protection of another during her flight to Anchorage. This selective violence suggests that Peter may have occupied a specific role within the family dynamic. While his sister was spared from the physical harm inflicted upon her brother, Fairbanks Police Chief Ron Dupuy spoke to the community following the arrest, stating that the death of a child is always devastating and that such accounts weigh heavily on the officers, detectives, and the entire community. He emphasized the department's commitment to seeking justice for Peter. The legal proceedings for Heather Alexi are ongoing, with the state focusing on the timeline of the injuries and the mother's state of mind during the days she remained in the apartment before fleeing. The account of Heather Alexi serves as a reminder that the vastness of the Alaskan landscape can be used as both a path for escape and a place to the rind. Yet it also shows that the integration of digital tools is closing the gap between the commission of a crime and the arrival of justice. Peter was a child whose life was cut short in the very place he should have been most protected, while his sister was forced to become a silent witness to a journey that ended in a police station hundreds of miles from home. Case 6. Mechele Linehan. In the suburban neighborhoods of Olympia, Washington, in the mid-2000s, Mechele Linehan was a person who appeared to have achieved the American dream. She was a college graduate with a master's degree, a mother, a church member, and a dedicated school volunteer. She was married to a doctor and spent her days in the quiet routines of family life. But in 2006, that mask was stripped away when the Alaska State Troopers arrived at her door. They were there to arrest her for a crime committed 10 years earlier in the wilderness of the North. The story begins in May 1996. Utility workers found the body of 36-year-old Kent Lepink near a lonely trail in Hope, Alaska, about 90 minutes south of Anchorage. He had been shot 3 times with a .44 Magnum. The subsequent inquiry revealed a complex web of relationships surrounding a woman then known as Mechele Hughes. Mechele had been an exotic dancer at the Great Alaskan Bush Company in Anchorage, where she attracted the attention of several men who were desperate for her affection. The prosecution's theory was that Mechele was a mastermind who had convinced 3 different men, Kent Lepink, John Carlin III, and Scott Hillyer, that she was engaged to them at the same time. At one point, she even lived in the same house with 2 of them. Investigators believed the motive for the crime was a $1 million life insurance policy on Kent's life. Mechele had reportedly paid for the policy herself and named herself as the primary beneficiary. What she allegedly did not know was that Kent had become suspicious. 5 days before his death, he removed her from the policy and wrote a statement to his parents to be opened only if he met a violent end. That document became known in legal circles as the letter from the grave. In it, Kent wrote, "Mechele, John or Scott were probably the people or persons that probably killed me. Make sure she is prosecuted." Despite this evidence, authorities did not have enough physical proof to make an arrest in 1996. Mechele left Alaska, shed her old life, and built the suburban persona that would later shock her new community in Washington. The case remained cold until 2004, when the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit reopened the odd file. They interviewed John Carlin's son, who had been a minor in 1996. As an adult, he provided testimony that he saw his father and Mechele washing a handgun in a bathroom sink just days after Kent's death. Consequently, both Mechele and John Carlin were arrested and convicted of murder in 2007. During the trial, the prosecution presented a theory that Mechele was following the plot of the 1994 movie The Last Destruction. In the film, a manipulative woman coaxes her lover into killing her husband for financial gain. A former co-worker testified that Mechele admired the lead character and said she wanted to be just like her. Mechele was sentenced to 99 years in prison. The legal journey took another turn in February 2010. The Alaska Court of Appeals overturned Mechele's conviction. The court ruled that the trial judge should never have allowed the letter from the grave or the testimony about the movie into the trial. They found that Kent's letter was inadmissible hearsay and that the movie theory was unfairly damaging to her character. While Mechele was awaiting a potential second trial, John Carlin was murdered in an Alaskan prison in 2008. Because Carlin died while his case was under appeal, his conviction was eventually wiped from the record. In 2012, an Anchorage judge dismissed the indictment against Mechele Linehan, and the state announced they would not seek to re-indict her. Today, Mechele remains a free woman. The case of the PTA mom remains one of the most debated accounts in Alaskan history. It challenges the assumption that maternal identity is always a shield for a person's past, and highlights the extreme difficulty of proving a conspiracy when the evidence is almost entirely circumstantial. Case 7. Sarah Diane. The case of Sarah Jane Diane is a study in immediate recidivism and the failure of a safety net designed to keep the public safe. In May 2025, Diane, then 39 years old, was sentenced for a series of crimes that began just hours after she was released from a correctional facility. Her actions in September 2020 left a coastal community in a state of disbelief and forced a hard look at the risks taken by private citizens who volunteer to supervise those awaiting trial. Keith Huss was a 57-year-old resident of Soldotna. His family and friends remembered him as a man with a large personality who enjoyed connecting with others through his work and his love of the outdoors. On September 28, 2020, a judge appointed Keith to serve as the third-party custodian for Sarah Diane. This role was a mandatory condition of her release on bail from the Wildwood Correctional Complex in Kenai. That same afternoon, Keith arrived at the jail to pick Sarah up. Their stated plan for the court was to drive to Anchorage together so Sarah could work at Keith's food truck. The transition from custody to a new beginning was supposed to be a path toward stability. Yet, that path ended abruptly on a lonely stretch of the Seward Highway. Early the next morning, just after midnight on September 29, a passing motorist discovered a body at the Turnagain Pass rest area. Alaska state troopers responded to the scene and identified the victim as Keith Huss. The forensic examination provided a map of a violent encounter. Keith had been shot 4 times with a .45 caliber pistol, had been struck by a vehicle. The man who had walked Sarah out of the jail doors to give her a chance at freedom had been executed on the side of the road less than a day later. The discovery of Keith's body triggered a statewide manhunt. Sarah Diane was considered armed and dangerous as she fled toward the coastal town of Seward. Her behavior during the flight further illustrated her lack of aim and ability to rehabilitation. Authorities eventually linked her to a series of vehicle thefts and the burglary of a cabin in the Seward area while she was evading capture. She was apprehended on October 1, 2020, after being spotted by members of the public. The financial data uncovered by investigators revealed a cold and opportunistic motive. Following the incident at Turnagain Pass, Sarah did not call for help. Instead, she used Keith's bank account to purchase items for herself and transferred hundreds of dollars into her own account to fund her movement. This decision to profit from the passing of her own court-appointed supervisor was a key piece of evidence during her legal proceedings. In late 2024, following a 7-week jury trial, Sarah was found guilty of 15 different crimes. These counts included murder in the 2nd degree, manslaughter, burglary, and being a felon in possession of a concealable firearm. The jury rejected parts of her testimony, and the judge noted that her accounts of the events were not credible. At her sentencing on May 2025, Superior Court Judge Michael Wolverton described the act as an execution. He sentenced her to a total of 68 years and 6 months in prison. Judge Wolverton emphasized that there were no mitigating factors in the case. He found that the remaining charges were all worst offenses, a designation used for those whose conduct is among the most serious in their category. The sentence was intended to reflect the community's condemnation and to serve as a permanent deterrent. The account of Sarah Diane serves as a cautionary tale about the third-party custody system in the last frontier. It shows how the state's reliance on private individuals to manage volatile offenders can lead to a tragic mismatch of intentions. Keith Huss was a man who stepped forward to help someone regain their footing, but he ended up in the path of a perpetrator who saw his presence as an obstacle rather than a lifeline. Case 8. Carly West, Anchorage, Alaska, February 15, 2017. In the early morning hours, as most residents of the Royal Suites Lodge were asleep, a car was set on fire in a carport beneath a 30-unit residential complex. What began as a desperate attempt by 2 individuals to avoid a legal encounter soon evolved into a disaster that claimed 3 lives and left dozens of people without a home. At the center of this inquiry was 35-year-old Carly K. West, formerly known as Carly K. Fox, and her partner, 36-year-old Andrew John Eknati. The background of this case is rooted in a series of reckless decisions. According to the Anchorage District Attorney's Office, West and Eknati had been driving under the influence and had successfully evaded police contact earlier that night. Because they were worried that the vehicle could be traced back to them, they made the decision to destroy the evidence. They drove the car into a carport at the Royal Suites Lodge, located near the intersection of Minnesota Drive and West 43rd Avenue, and intentionally set it ablaze. The fire did not stay contained to the vehicle. It moved with terrifying speed, fueled by the structure of the carport and the winter air. As the flames reached the living quarters, residents were forced to make life-or-death choices in a matter of seconds. The fire was so intense and moved so quickly that some people had to jump from second-story windows to escape the smoke and heat. The human cost of this act was devastating. 3 women lost their lives that morning. Vivian Hall was found inside one of the units, while her roommate, Laura Kramer, was transported to a medical facility in Seattle, where she passed away days later from her injuries. The third victim was Tuelilo Newer. In an act of ultimate maternal protection, Newer died at the scene after following her daughters as they jumped from a window to escape the flames. The inquiry conducted by the Anchorage Police Department's Homicide Unit, the Anchorage Fire Department, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives took years to bring to a conclusion. Detectives eventually linked West and Eknati to the arson and the subsequent loss of life. While the defendants were originally charged with 3 counts of murder in the second degree, a plea agreement was eventually reached. In May 2024, both West and Eknati pleaded guilty to 3 counts of manslaughter and a consolidated count of assault in the first degree. During the sentencing hearing on October 2024, the emotional weight of the tragedy was shared through the statements of the victims. They spoke of the continued trauma and the permanent void left by the loss of their loved ones. Superior Court Judge Andrew Peterson, in delivering the sentence, noted that the court must recognize the community's condemnation of such actions. He described the conduct as manifesting an extreme indifference to the value of human life. West was sentenced to a total of 60 years and 20 days in prison. Still, the court suspended 36 years of that time. Upon her eventual release, she will be required to serve 10 years of supervised felony probation. This case serves as a critique of what some have called domestic terror via negligence. Carly West was a person who, in her desperation to avoid a relatively minor legal charge for driving under the influence, was willing to ignite a fire in a building where dozens of other families were sleeping. This account challenges the idea that maternal evil only involves direct acts against one's own children. It shows how a total lack of communal empathy can lead to the destruction of other mothers and their families. Tuelilo Newer's final act was to save her children, while West's act was to save herself at the cost of everyone else in the building. We are reaching the final cases in our investigation. Subscribe now to ensure you do not miss our upcoming investigation into the dark history of the Pacific Northwest. Case 9, Susan Schubert. In Case 9, we transition to a story that forces us to ask a difficult question: who holds the ultimate responsibility for a crime when the perpetrator is a child? This is the account of Susan Schubert and the generational failure that led to the actions of her daughter, Winona Fletcher. In 1985, the city of Anchorage was left in a state of shock following a triple homicide in the Russian Jack neighborhood. The victims were 69-year-old Tom Faccio, his 70-year-old wife Ann Faccio, and her sister, 75-year-old Amelia Elliott. The person responsible for these acts was just 14 years old. At the time, Winona Fletcher became the youngest female in the history of Alaska to be convicted of murder. Yet, as the legal system revisited her case decades later during a series of resentencing hearings in 2025, the focus of the inquiry shifted. The court began to examine the mother, Susan Schubert, and the environmental factors she had provided for her child. During these proceedings, legal experts and family members provided a map of the environment Susan Schubert created. It was not a home defined by protection or stability. Instead, it was a landscape of substance abuse and profound neglect. Testimony revealed that Susan had brought a series of abusive and drug-addicted men into the residence. Even more unsettling was the evidence that Winona had been subjected to physical and sexual abuse starting when she was only 5 years old. When Winona reached her 14th year, the maternal bond was completely severed. Susan Schubert was evicted from her residence and left the area without providing a way for her daughter to contact her. This abandonment left a 14-year-old child alone in downtown Anchorage with no resources and no safety net. In a desperate attempt to survive, she turned to the streets. It was during this period of extreme vulnerability that she met an older boyfriend who would eventually lead her into the events of 1985. The Anchorage court in 2025 had to weigh the concept of maternal culpability. While Susan Schubert did not participate in the physical act of the crime, the state's legal experts argued that she was responsible for the psychological collapse of her daughter. They described a cycle of trauma where the mother's choices ensured that the child had no path toward a healthy adulthood. A clinical psychologist testified that a child raised in such a chaotic environment lacks the maturity and judgment to resist the influence of predatory adults. This segment of our investigation highlights the idea that some mothers commit their crimes through a slow, persistent withdrawal of care. By the age of 14, Winona's sense of reality had been warped by a decade of trauma. The legal proceedings eventually led to a resentencing, with the judge acknowledging that the characteristics of youth and the horrific setting of her upbringing had to be considered under the Alaska Constitution. Following the 1985 incident, the daughters of Tom and Ann Fascia were so impacted by their experience in the courtroom that they started a movement. Janice Fascio Linehan founded an organization called Victims for Justice. This group was intended to extend rights to those impacted by violent acts and remains an influential force in Alaska today. Yet, even as they fought for systemic change, they were forced to relive the details of that night for 40 years. They described the scene on Glacier Street as a permanent memory that could never be erased. In the 2025 hearing, the court relied on scientific research about the developing brain. This research showed that areas involved in behavior control and risk assessment continue to mature through late adolescence. This scientific evidence supported the finding that Winona was uniquely susceptible to the negative influences permitted into her life by her mother. Superior Court Judge Jack McKenna eventually modified the sentence to 60 years. With mandatory parole provisions, this decision means that Fletcher will be eligible for release after serving 40 active years. The story of Susan Schubert and Winona Fletcher is a reminder that the shadow of the last frontier often hides cycles of domestic tragedy that span decades. It forces the justice system to look past the individual act to find the root cause. For the families involved, the weight of the crime has lasted for generations, beginning in a home where a mother failed in her most basic duty, to be the shield between her child and the darkness of the world. Case 10. Tessa Hillyer. In the interior of Alaska, the city of Fairbanks serves as a backdrop for many accounts where the lines between protection and aggression become blurred. In May 2025, a series of events at the Whitefish campground forced the justice system to examine the victimized woman narrative when it is challenged by precise forensic evidence. At the center of this inquiry was 38-year-old Fairbanks resident Tessa Hillyer. The case began early in the morning on May 6, 2025. Hillyer's stepmother contacted the Alaska State Troopers to report a disturbing conversation. She stated that Tessa had admitted to taking the life of another person. When the troopers arrived at the Whitefish campground, they found both Hillyer and her stepmother at the scene. Nearby, they discovered the body of 48-year-old Raymond McPherson Jr. The scene was one of extreme violence. The victim had been struck by 6 bullets. From the first moments of the interaction with law enforcement, Hillyer maintained a consistent defense. She claimed that she had acted in self-defense after McPherson assaulted her. She pointed to a visible bruise that was developing near her eye as physical proof of a struggle. During her trial, she testified that she and McPherson were friends and that she had driven him to her campsite earlier that day. She alleged that the atmosphere shifted when McPherson tried to force her into a sexual encounter and struck her in the face when she refused. Hillyer stated that she pushed him away and retreated into a van. According to her testimony, she was unable to find her vehicle keys and retrieved a pistol from the van, continuing to search for the keys while armed. Yet, as the state's forensic team mapped the evidence, a different story began to emerge. The ballistics report was unambiguous. Of the 6 gunshot wounds found on McPherson's body, 2 were located in his head and had been delivered at a downward angle. 3 other rounds had entered through his back and side. For the prosecution, these trajectories provided a map of an execution rather than a mutual struggle. They argued that the downward angle indicated the victim was already on the ground when the final shots were fired, while the wounds in the back suggested he was retreating or incapacitated. The biological data further complicated Hillyer's claim of an imminent threat. At the time of his death, McPherson's blood alcohol level was 0.36. A person at this level of intoxication would be severely impaired, suffering from a loss of motor control and coordination. The state argued that a man in such a condition was an unlikely physical threat to Hillyer, who, while also intoxicated, had the presence of mind to retrieve a firearm and deliver multiple accurate shots. The legal proceedings took place in Fairbanks and concluded in December 2025. The jury was tasked with deciding if the physical evidence supported a finding of justifiable homicide. While the defense emphasized the history of domestic violence in Alaska and the trauma Hillyer had experienced, the prosecution focused on the forensic mismatch. They argued that the number and placement of the shots exceeded any reasonable use of force for protection. The Fairbanks jury eventually rejected the self-defense shield. They acquitted Hillyer of the charge of murder in the first degree, which requires a premeditated intent to take a life. Still, they found her guilty of murder in the second degree. Hillyer is currently being held on a no-bail status as she awaits her sentencing, which is scheduled for May 11, 2026. She faces a prison term ranging from 15 to 99 years. This final account serves as a critique of how perpetrators sometimes attempt to use the state's genuine concern for victims as a camouflage for their own acts. When the forensic evidence, such as 6 shots to a highly intoxicated and retreating victim, contradicts the narrative of a desperate struggle, the truth is revealed in the angles of the bullets and the data in the blood dye. We have explored 10 accounts that have left an indelible mark on the history of Alaska. Before we conclude, I want to hear your perspective. Which of these cases did you find the most thought-provoking from a legal standpoint? Let us know in the comments. Your insights help us understand which investigations resonate most with our community.